When I originally reviewed God of War in 2018, I gave it a 10 out of 10 for its masterful storytelling, world building, and truly fun combat. It took one of my most hated video game characters and made him one of my favorites. I was astonished by Sony Santa Monica's ability to completely reshape his character using the narrative already written out. For 2022's God of War Ragnarok, I had a lot of high expectations for this title, although I must admit my excitement dwindled a bit upon hearing it was going from being a PS5 exclusive to a multi-platform release. I was hoping for a bit more of a technical jump with this release, and even if it isn't a gigantic leap in regards to visuals, it's a profoundly great follow-up and arguably PlayStation's strongest IP to date. I'll try my best not to rob you of its phenomenal storytelling, so I'll just keep things a bit vague and spoiler-free. God of War Ragnarok takes place a few years after the events of the 2018 game. Yes, you do have to play that title to understand this one. There is a brief recap video in this new entry's main menu, but brief is an understatement, and instead it gives you a paraphrased version of the ending without much context to go off of. God of War 2018 was a masterpiece. You should most definitely go play it if you haven't already. Now, despite this new entry's name being Ragnarok, this title isn't so much about the end of the world, but the people actively in it. It's a character study on a young boy dealing with defiance and learning to grow, while surrounded by grief and love. Likewise, it further develops the role of the former God of War, who has been shaping the future of what's left of his family. It does this while describing Norse mythology into what is nothing short of an epic journey that's equal parts poetry and destruction. While the story focuses on Kratos and his family, it doesn't belittle the supporting cast, including the characters we're meant to see as antagonists. The time jump has affected everyone, and we see the aftermath of the last game come into effect for some new and familiar NPC characters. Even those we call villains get their own time to develop, letting us in on their despair and motivations, at times getting us to sympathize with them or at least come to an understanding regarding their actions. That's yet to touch upon the handful of extra hours and whole map areas you can spend exploring that doesn't pertain specifically to the main story, yet pack a punch that's just as impactful at times. Ragnarok exceeds at building a world that's exciting and enthralling, well beyond the events at play that no doubt speak highly of its writing. Across its roughly 30-hour journey, Sony Santa Monica was able to weave the destructive combat God of War is known for with some of the most beautiful and delicate writing I've seen in video games. It's nothing short of outstanding and a pivotal example of narrative storytelling well beyond just video games. If you played God of War 2018, you'll find a lot of Ragnarok to feel familiar. Kratos still has the Leviathan axe weapon that he's able to swing around with a light or heavy attack. Likewise, he's able to do light or heavy throws of said weapon. The Blades of Chaos that were unlocked toward the end of the last game are available from the onset with this one, and like the Leviathan, have an assortment of light and heavy attacks. Instead of a throw, you can use these to pull enemies towards you, or even to platform around, and in conjunction with the Leviathan, you're able to juggle and combo enemies not exactly like the original PS2 games, but more like a Uncharted combat hybrid. These weapons have new tricks up their sleeves too. With the press of the triangle button, you're able to add a frostbite to the Leviathan or ignite the Blades of Chaos. These elemental changes help inflict a burn or a freeze on enemies while also working to break elemental shields on some of the newer enemies. Speaking of shields, Kratos has one as well, and they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes now. Depending on the shield that you craft, you might have a shield that favors countering over blocking, some might even have some elemental powers too. This addition to the combat arsenal only continues to add variety to the combat as you combo together the various weapons at your disposal. With that said, how could I forget Kratos' built-in weapon, his fist? While activating your strength meter, Kratos can unleash a fury of melee attacks that tap into the God of War's most vicious nature. Kratos also has weapon attachments, accessories, a skill tree, and a handful of other RPG mechanics that don't completely change him, but do further flesh out his abilities and how those abilities can combo together. All in all, the new additions to combat continue to develop the still addicting nature of using the Leviathan while expanding the arsenal with new skills and weapons. Outside of combat, you'll spend a lot of your time exploring the various realms. You'll even revisit a few spots from the last entry, although with the change in time and seasons, they might look a bit different. Seeing areas I used to be able to visit now frozen over truly complements the world building established in the last game. Puzzles also take a larger chunk of the gameplay this time, with rewards and unlockables for those that spend the time on them. Occasionally this does feel like it slows down the story's pacing, but it also leads to some of the best conversations within the main cast. What I will say stood out to me a lot by the later half of the game was the combat section difficulty. The later half of the game fights felt more challenging, not so much from the difficulty of enemies, but the amount of enemies at once. More often than not, Ragnarok would throw a handful of enemies and quite literally overwhelm me, not really giving me the tools to counter, at least not that many enemies at once. These were the small amount of times I felt Ragnarok stumbled a bit in its pacing and its combat. God of War Ragnarok is a multi-platform release that looks to max out the hardware on the PS4 while taking advantage of the PS5's additional resources. When compared to 2018's God of War, Ragnarok features finer details in texture work, more accurate reflections specifically in water, and finally a high frame rate mode at launch, at least on the PS5. On the base PS4 you can play at a 1080p 30fps target, and that does a pretty on par job with the 2018 God of War. The performance is fine, but having played God of War on PS5, you can really feel the difference in frame rate here. If you have a PS4 Pro, that resolution gets bumped up to a dynamic 1440p to 1600p if you lock it to 30fps, or a dynamic 1080p to 1600p if you run unlocked frame rate. On the Pro, that frame rate tends to average around the low 50 frames per second, but it's not very consistent. On the PS5, you get the option to play in either performance or quality mode. Quality mode renders at a native 4K resolution with a 30fps target. In performance mode, that gets a 1440p to 4K dynamic resolution that tends to hover around 1800p with a solid 60fps. Dynamic 4K 60 is what I ended up playing the most in, and the footage you're seeing throughout this review. While the quality mode does render more detail in faraway objects, it wasn't enough for me to really want to sacrifice my frame rate for it. God of War Ragnarok's music direction brings Norse mythology to life in what is one of the most interesting interpretations of the lore. The new haptic feedback for the DualSense only further makes throwing and calling back to Leviathan all the more satisfying. The returning and new cast also do a marvelous job at portraying their characters. Returning characters have a lot more to work with in terms of their growth, and new characters, both those in antagonistic roles and those in just regular roles, are memorable and fascinating interpretations of famous Norse mythology characters. God of War Ragnarok is a worthy follow-up to the 2018 God of War. In many ways, it further fleshes out the greatness established with that entry. The writing here, I think, is arguably better, at least with the conversations and the character development. Combat is just as good now, with more abilities, weapons, and customization. The world building and explorable areas are a lot grander, with this game being at least 30 hours long in length, not accounting for the length of the side quests you can embark on. I thought the puzzles could slow down the pacing a bit, and the later combat sessions felt a bit overwhelming without being properly equipped with the correct way to counter them. While I have my caveats here and there, they never outweighed the brilliance on display. God of War went from being my least favorite IP to my favorite IP in 2018, and now it continues to be so with God of War Ragnarok. This is another must play from PlayStation, and although I won't go as far as saying that you have to buy a PS5 to play this, it's fine on PS4 Pro, but if you have the option to play on a PS5, most definitely that is the platform to get it on.